Hello, I am Dr. Caroline Heldman, the Executive Director of the Representation Project. We are a nonprofit organization that uses films and campaigns in order to shift damaging gender norms and stereotypes. We were founded by Jennifer Siebel Newsom over a decade ago, and our work includes lots of interviews with experts about how we can make the world a better place. And today we are focusing on a subject that is very near and dear to my heart as a political scientist, and that is women's representation in politics. We are honored to be interviewing Mary Chung Hayashi today. She has a new book out. The book is called Women in Politics, Breaking Barriers to Achieve True Representation. And she tells a riveting story of progress of trailblazing women, mostly through interviews with these women, but also provides an excellent analysis of the barriers that women still face as they're trying to get into political positions. But before we jump into this interview, let me tell you about Mary. Mary Chung Hayashi is an award-winning national healthcare leader and an author and a former California State Assembly member. So she is a former woman in politics. So she knows about these challenges firsthand, and we'll be jumping into that in this interview. She is a distinguished public servant. Mary has spearheaded substantial reforms in mental health services in particular, and she's also championed gender equality, and she forges unprecedented, powerful partnerships with social causes and corporate sponsorship, a lot of causes that previously had no financial or public backing. Mary has been recognized as the Legislator of the Year by the American Red Cross and the California Medical Association. Mary has also been featured on Redbook's Mothers and Shakers top list and the Ladies' Home Journal Women to Watch list. As the principal of public policy and advocacy solutions, she has successfully advised businesses and policy leaders on some of today's most complex and pressing public policy matters. Mary remains a steadfast proponent of social justice expansion and the rights of underrepresented communities. And it really is a joy to be speaking with her today about her new book and about her experiences with women in politics. So Mary, welcome. Let's jump right in.
I just remember thinking, reading about feminism in the United States really allowed me to see that we don't have to be controlled by our backgrounds, ethnicities, or family histories. And it really allowed me to change my entire trajectory. And so, sorry for the long winded answer to this, but I didn't grow up thinking that I would pursue politics or become an advocate. Not at all. It's the opposite. But it was that class at Cal State Long Beach and reading about feminist literature that really changed my life. And so that's why I keep wanting to write, I think, because I want to be able to give that same sense of hope that you can change your path if you don't want that, if you don't want to do what your parents says you should be doing, that in fact you can do what you want to, what you're passionate about. So from that moment on, I came up to the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area, put myself through college. I started a national nonprofit organization looking at Asian American women's health issues because I've always wondered what happened to my sister. Like, why is mental illness so stigmatized? And yet, so many people suffer from mental illness. And so, I really wanted to learn more about what happened to her, why Asian American women do not have a voice at the table. And so, I started this organization and started lobbying the federal government. And one of the biggest things that I've accomplished through that organization is fundamentally change the way our federal government collects data on Asian American and Asian American women. Because before my advocacy work, they weren't really including us. We were sort of like in the other category. And so after that experience, I had an opportunity to work for then Assembly Member Darrell Steinberg, who championed mental health in the legislature. And so by that example, I was able to see that, oh, I could do that, and that's why this role modeling effect is so important, because even though I had lobbied members of Congress and people like Nancy Pelosi, and I worked with Tipper Gore on sponsoring the first ever mental health conference at the White House, I've done those type of things, but I've never imagined myself doing doing the work as a legislator. And it wasn't until I met Daryl, who was an assembly member, and he was a big mental health parity champion. And I learned from him that I could do that. And that's what inspired me to run for office ultimately. So I'll stop there, but that's my sort of almost 30 plus years, past 30 plus years summary in a nutshell.
What an incredible journey. I'm curious, what does your family think of you now and your ambitions and your successes?
Well, my mother passed away last year, and we weren't really close because she also suffered from mental health issues, and so it was very difficult for her to, I think, to play an active role in the kids' lives. So that was really hard for her. But I think my dad just kind of like accepts me the way I am now. But I got married late, and so they were like, "Oh, thank God! Like somebody is willing to marry her, even though she's 35." So they were very happy about that. So there's certain milestones that they, I think, like to remember more than others. I'm not so sure that politics or running for office is one of them.
Yeah, that's oh, how funny, right? The I'm sure very proud of you, but also it's just such a challenge, right? When you're in a tradition, I grew up in a very traditional family as well, and it's just such a challenge to their way of being. And I realized, years later that that in some ways my mother felt it was an indictment, right? That I wasn't more traditional, an indictment of her lifestyle. And of course, what feminism is all about is fighting for that choice.
Right, right. Did you grow up in California?
In rural Washington State,
Okay.
Pentecostal, evangelical, homeschool, the whole nine. So, uh, we were actually in DC at the same time. I was at the mental health conference at the White House. I had no idea you
Oh,
planned that. And this is how small the world is, Mary. How wonderful.
oh,
Um,
wow. I love
they,
that.
they were like praying for me every day when I was in DC because they didn't like demonic politics. Okay. So centering now on your career in politics, what challenges did you face running as a woman of color? And then what did you face, the barriers or experiences, microaggressions, macroaggressions you may have faced when you were governing?
Well, yes. So I have lots to say about that, like 50,000 words. so, but so when I decided to run for office, I thought, well, I I can raise money. I know how to do that because headed up a nonprofit organization that was very successful. And Tipper Gore endorsed me, and Nancy Pelosi, Anna Eshoo, a lot of these women who were helping me, with my nonprofit work, were very encouraging and excited to see me run for office. So I thought I was all that. I thought, oh wow, I am gonna do this, and I got all these great women behind me. And I raised like $100,000 within like 60 days of announcing, and I thought, oh, this is so great. I reached out to the Alameda County Democratic Party chairwoman at the time, and I was really anxious to meet with her and just kind of tell her my plans. I was going to win, and she asked me this. She said, "Well, why don't you run for the hospital board or city council first, so you can have some campaign experience?" Suggesting that that I'm not really ready for this. And I will never forget that because I thought, wow, I thought I did a really good job like putting together my campaign. I'm like, I have all these big names behind me. But she thought I wasn't ready. Um, and I think it really hurt me at the time because I actually wrote about it in my book. It had an impact because later on I realized that women get discouraged from running a lot more than men, just because we're not supposed to be ambitious,
Right.
and we're not supposed to self promote, or we're not supposed to take too much credit. We can't be too assertive either because we get penalized for that. We're not supposed to be like a show masculine style of leadership. We're supposed to be more feminine, and especially for Asian women, my gosh, we're supposed to be grateful and submissive. And when we portray, the stereotype that's contrary to those, we get penalized for those things. And so I didn't really understand all of that at the time, but it really hurt my feelings. But I thought, I'm just going to do it anyway. I'm just going to proceed with my plan because I do feel like I was prepared, I was qualified, and I was ready to do it. My opponent, I ran against a man who had never ran for office either. And I did ask the Democratic Party chairwoman, did you ask him the same question that you're asking me? And she didn't really answer, which tells me she probably didn't. And I will never forget, there was a newspaper editorial that said that while I had impressive healthcare experience, it was too narrow. Like my experience was just not broad enough. It was just too much healthcare, basically. Whereas my opponent was a firefighter for 30 years. That's the only job he had. But they said, well, he could actually do more. And so what I've learned from that experience and through the research that I've done is that men get evaluated based on their potential. Whereas women, we have to prove that we're qualified. And even then it's not enough, because like I don't know if you got to the part where I talk about men rules study where 60% of men who basically have the same qualifications as the women said that they were very qualified. And then the same question was asked to the women about, do you think you're qualified to run for office? Only like 1/3 of the women said they're qualified. So we don't even really view ourselves as qualified, even when we're qualified. And so I really experienced that through my campaign and through the interviews I've done with these women in my book. It was very obvious that over and over again, it wasn't just like one time, like you put it on your website, like I'm qualified and this is my resume, but it's every interview, every opportunity where you're speaking to people, you have to prove your qualification if you're a woman. Whereas male candidates, they don't do that. They're just automatically assumed that they're qualified.
Yep, they walk in the door and have that assumption. And did you encounter more bias when you actually won the seat and you were in the legislature?
Well, so one other sort of campaign experience that I wanted to kind of talk about too is that being women of color, like for Asian, like I'm Asian American, and my opponent would have a campaign said that says, well, so and so for Asian Americans. So he would try to say that he had Asian American endorsements and somehow that was newsworthy. So whereas like I can't ever say like Mary Hayashi, white male for Mary Hayashi. I can't say that because that's weird, right? And white male can say like women for someone, Asians for someone. And so the intersection of race and gender kind of plays out in a really disadvantaged way. Like I'm supposed to represent and I'm supposed to have every Asian woman support. And if I don't, like there's something wrong with me. Like every woman's supposed to support you for some reason. So that was also an interesting experience. And then, when I got elected, I was so excited. I had a really tough race and I was like so excited. And I was the first Korean American woman to be elected to the legislature. And I thought, oh, I understand why I'm the first. Who would want to do this? I mean, I had to, because I mean, even just like talk about fundraising, for instance, it's a lot of women see fundraising as a major barrier to entering politics. And I was taught never, ever to ask money from strangers. My God, like the shame you will bring onto your family. But I had to like make cold calls to these men, donors, like, oh, hello, my name is, and then ask for money. And that was something that we weren't supposed to do. So it took me a while to really adjust to some of those things that I had to do. But you can do it. Like if I can do it, like anybody can do it. My first job, I didn't even ask how much it was like I was going to get paid. because it was just something that we weren't allowed to talk about. We just weren't encouraged to talk about. So after I won, I think I was very fortunate to chair a huge policy committee, and I was really excited about this. But I kind of noticed that you know pe- people didn't take my sort of straightforwardness very well. I think people describe me as aggressive, very competitive.
Mhm.
And whereas like a male chair of a policy committee would be described as, oh, very strong committee chair. And then so I'm like, I don't think I'm aggressive, but I think just that stereotype and having that sort of unconscious bias, the stereotype of what Asian American women are supposed to be really played a role, I think. And one of the things that I talk about in my book specifically is this problem of misidentification. I don't know if you know Fiona Ma, but she and I were elected at the same time. We were the only two Asian women in the legislature, and people would call me Fiona constantly. And at the time, I kind of laughed off the whole thing because I'm like, haha, that's funny. They call her Mary, they call me Fiona. That's kind of funny. But when I started doing this, more research for the book, I realized that it happens to people of color a lot more, and that when people keep mix, if people keep doing that for like 6 years, you go to work and you don't recognize your supervisor for 6 years, for example, that says that person isn't important to you. And so it really takes an emotional toll, I think, and it makes us feel invisible. And in politics, visibility is so important. Um, and so it was challenging. It was a lot of experiences while serving in office were things that I never expected, never. Mm-mm.
Mm.
And that was one of them. Was like constantly having to remind people who I am, like just like basic things, my name, for example. So anyway, that's just one example that I share in my book.
And being reminded, right, that you essentially being sent all of these messages that you don't belong, which is what women, especially women of color, you're talking about a Korean American woman's experience in the state legislature in California, the first, and you're just constantly getting these messages that you don't belong. And in your book, you write a lot about the imagination barrier, right? That little girls get this message that they don't belong very early on, and it continues throughout our life. Can you speak more about that imagination barrier?
Yes, I love talking about this. Well, especially with you, because I mean, you guys started this. I still remember, um, you know, I think it was 2011 or 2010, 11, around that time. I went to the California Women's Legislative Caucus, and some of the women said, hey, have you guys seen this new film, Misrepresentation by, Jennifer Newsom? And we were like, oh, we're intrigued. What is this about? And so we actually sponsored a showing at the Crest Theater, and my gosh, we really we just felt so heard and just so empowered and on so many levels, even though the film really does a great job of explaining what the problems are. But it was so great that somebody was actually out there telling our stories, like the stories that really impact our lives. And so I mean, I love that your organization calls it a public health crisis. And I agree with you, like gender stereotypes really have an impact on, entry to politics as well. And so anyway, we love that movie, and the imagination barrier term, as you know, as a political scientist, I mean, that's a name that was given to describe sort of role modeling effect. But the best story that I was able to capture through the interviews is Amanda Hunter, who's the executive director of the Barbara Lee Family Foundation in Boston. The organization did this focus group, and they asked the participants to envision um, a governor, and overwhelming majority envisioned a man. And so they gave this unconscious bias a name, and they called it the imagination barrier, meaning that people can't see, or they can't imagine seeing a different kind of person doing those jobs. And I think Jennifer Newsom said it so well in her film that you can't be what you can't see, and that still resonates with many women today, obviously, because this focus group was done last year. But what the study also found is that when a woman is elected to public office, that breaks down that imagination barrier, and it allows people to reimagine what people could do and what leadership roles look like. And so there's hope there, And so I really want to thank you and your organization for leading that conversation. And you've been doing it for over a decade. And I think we are seeing changes for sure.
We're definitely seeing some
Yeah.
movement. And yeah, what a great film, Jen's misrepresentation. And that the feminist click moment, right? For so many people that they're living it, they're thinking they're experiencing whatever it is, whether it's body hatred and shame, or not having ambition and not really being in the world, or the living the life that they want to live, and thinking they're experiencing that alone. And then all of a sudden you have this experience where, oh, this is a systemic issue. We're all getting these messages. We're all feeling this way. So your book is really great because it focuses too on a lot of the wins of pioneering women in politics. Tell us some of your favorite interviews, your favorite and women you focused on, even if you didn't interview them, and why are their stories so important?
So I mean, they're all amazing women. There's 17 women in the book, one man. They're all great. One of the stories told by the Florida Senate Minority Leader, Lauren Book, and her leadership campaign is amazing because after she won her Senate race, here she is, 35-year-old, young, amazing, dynamic woman. Um, Somebody in our caucus suggested, like, hey, why don't you run for the Democratic caucus chair? You could be our leader. And an older white male told her that, oh, are you sure you can do that? You just had a baby. And, you probably can't like manage both, and so as I have another chapter on the politics of motherhood, because if you have small children, the voters will think about whether you can do both. If you don't have children, then the voters will wonder if you will understand what families go through. So it's one of those issues that impact women candidates, because no male candidate is going to be asked those questions, or I haven't seen any. So anyway, what she basically told you know, um, her colleague that I do have I have twins. I think she had twins, and she said I do have small children, but I could do both. And those comments really motivated her to run. She's like, when somebody tells me I can't do something, I'm going to do it just to prove that I could do it. And I think a lot of women in the book sort of share that spirit. We don't get deterred by those comments. And she ran and she won. Um, so so I love these stories, and I loved that LaFonza Butler, our senator, when I interviewed her, she was at the time she was the head of the Emily's List. But I love her quote because I would give the same advice to other women who are asking this question. Do it anyway. I mean, seriously, because you are going to you're going to experience that. You're going to experience these sexist and racist bias comments and questions from people, and but you can do it, and it's really just knowing that you can and just taking a chance. So I love that quote, do it anyway.
Just do it, Nike. Do it anyway. Well, and you absolutely have to have that in order to be successful in politics, right? Because as women are, and especially women of color, are going to be facing all of this outsider talk, right? The microaggressions, the, confusing you for Fiona, thinking you don't belong in the room. I mean, it just happens so often that you have to be prepared to push through that, right? The skin has just got to be thicker, and it's vitally important, though, that we need underrepresented, marginalized people in positions of power. And right now, 51% of the US are women. We've never had a woman president. We are celebrating being up at 26% in Congress. We're about 25% now with governors. So we have this massive gap between where we need to be in terms of democratic representation and where we are. And we've made great progress. So it's this, we're celebrating, but we're also saying, wait a minute, it's going to take 130 years at this pace for us to get progress at the federal level. Can you talk to us, Mary, about why it's so important to have a diversity of voices representing us in the halls of power?
Well, yes, and just to you know just to mention that last year the World Economic Forum said that it would, at this pace, like it would take 143 years to reach gender parity, like at this current pace. So we do need to accelerate, and basically tear down these barriers that exist and get more of these party structures and elected officials to start seriously recruiting women, because recruitment is the key and it has worked. But women don't run for office to seek fame and fortune. They run to solve problems. Like that, women. I asked this. I asked the same questions to all the women in my book. What motivated you to run? Why did you run for office? And studies have shown that men tend to run for office because they seek a leadership position. They're ambitious. They're encouraged to be ambitious. There was a really interesting study that showed that college-age women chose nonprofit to make a difference, whereas men said they would run for office. That was their primary vehicle for social change. And so there's some serious like gender gap there. But women run because they have a very specific issue that they want to work on. Like for me, it was mental health, and I authored legislation that created the Office of Suicide Prevention for California. And so, I mean, those types of public policy issues were the reasons why I ran for office. And the interview showed that, and the research showed that significant achievement in healthcare, education, gender equality are all possible because more women are running for office. The best example that summarizes this is, late Congresswoman Patricia Schroeder. And I loved her quote when she was the first woman to serve on the Congressional House's Armed Services Committee. One of her male colleagues said, "Well, how are you able to do this, when you have kids?" And it's interesting because women still get that question, and this was like in the 70s or 80s. And she said, "Well, I have a uterus and a brain, and I use both." Because she was a lawyer, she was a pilot, she was very accomplished, but she's the one who engineered the Family and Medical Leave Act. And think about how that fundamentally changed the way women and men, not just women, but parents are able to take up to 12 weeks after they have, unpaid, leave to care for their family members, for example. She's the one who authored the legislation that stopped employers from discriminating women based on pregnancy. So, I mean, one woman can have that kind of effect. And so there's a strong correlation between more women in government and just improved public policy for all, including women and families. And women champion issues that are not very popular or often don't have lobbyists, like foster care issues, homelessness, mental health. I mean, a lot of these issues are championed by women. And so that's why I love talking about gender equality and the parity, because they're obviously interconnected. And, parity means equality as well, not just the numbers.
Absolutely. So let's jump into some of these questions. Lots of folks have put questions in the Q&A as you've been talking, Mary. They've been inspired. The question that you just answered, right, about democracy and how women have not only different pathways in different motivations for getting there, but then when they're there, they're going to legislate in different ways. um, it's just vital, right, that we have that level of diversity, that we have better representation, both in terms of the actual numbers, and then what happens when you get there, right? Which is that you're going to be pulling for different policies, as you mentioned, Pat Schroeder and the Pregnancy Discrimination Act. Um, Anonymous asks, what advice would you give to young women who feel disenchanted with politics and leadership after experiences of feeling invisible and constantly condescended to?
Hmm. Well, that's really an important question because that really describes how, I felt. And many women interviewed in this book, have those experiences. So I'm not diminishing or I'm not saying those are, you know, um, that's not important, but it is, something that should be considered in the context of like your overall journey. That's just, we all have setbacks and discouragement, and women do experience, a lot more discouragement. Like it's really happening. People think that women can't win. People think that women can't raise the money, and we're not as well connected. I mean, all of these things, go against us. And for women of color, I mean, think about this. I mean, it's what, 80 cents to a dollar now, where women, the gender pay gap is a real issue. For Latinas, it's 46% less than white men right now. And even though Latinas are, attending college at higher, rates than ever before, it hasn't eliminated that pay gap. And a lot of that bias is because of stereotypes. I mean, this is how harmful, racial stereotypes could be. It directly impacts, our ability to make money and live. And so those are real issues. And I think that we could easily get discouraged by a number of these statistics or our experiences. But if you have passion for something, because politics isn't like you apply for a job and then they interview you and they hire you. This campaigns are sometimes could be, years long. I have a friend who ran for assembly twice and lost, finally won a state senate seat. So he's been running since 2002. So, and he just won, 2 decades later. And so, it's the journey really requires resilience and momentum. And you really need to be able to not give up because of certain experiences. And I don't know if that makes sense, because it does, we do tend to focus on, oh, like my party chair said I shouldn't run, right, but I did anyway. So it's really important to kind of see this as a long-term game. And that's the difference between campaigning and applying for a job, is that you have to, when you're campaigning, you have to talk about yourself like 4 or 5 times a day, to perfect strangers. And so you really have to have that passion. You have to have that passion that this is something that you really, really want. And there's always going to be somebody who's gonna, have that unconscious bias about what women's role should be or what younger person's role should be. But don't let that stop you. There's so many examples in my book.
There are, and boy, that's the answer. Actually, give them a copy of your book. And you had brought up the wage gap, and it reminded me that a great report that came out last week. Dr. Nicole Haggard at Mount St. Mary's University is a principal on the report on the status of girls and women in California, and they looked at the pay gap in a really interesting way, of how long you would have to work as a woman of color to earn what a white man will make by age 65, right? So, retirement age for a white man, you would have to work 95 years as a Black woman, You would have to work 75 years as an Asian American and 75 years as a white woman. You would have to work 115 years as a Latin woman in order to make the same amount of what a white man is making when he retires. So the biases are real. And as you point out, Mary, education is not closing that gap with Latin women, which is so telling that there are other factors at play. And you brought up stereotypes, right? And this othering. And this ties in really well to Kimberly's question. She asks, how can we better encourage teen girls to pursue careers in politics and to be change makers and influencers in their communities and nationally when they're getting these messages?
Well, I think yeah, obviously, I like to think that this, webinar is contributing to that solution. But I recently had an opportunity to speak to Bay Area high school girls conference. It was so hard. I mean, I I enjoyed it, but it was really, really hard. And I asked at the beginning of the talk, like, how many of you are thinking of going into politics? Two girls raised their hand. So I said, okay, great. And it was about, I think, 80 high school girls from all over the Bay Area. After my talk, I said, okay, so how many of you want to pursue politics now? Only one raised her hand, so I lost one. I know.
I
So,
was hoping you would say all the hands
yeah.
went up. But no, I mean, when you actually tell them what they're facing, right? It becomes a little real.
But this is what I've learned. So afterwards, I did my book signing, and so everyone came up and talked to me individually, and I was so inspired because many girls expressed interest in politics, but they felt that they just didn't think that they were good enough. That, like, who do you think you are? Kind of messaging was sort of was the best way to describe it. Like, can I do something like that? That was sort of their question to me. So it was actually really encouraging. And I also found out I met so many girls who are hoping to be engineers, doctors, astronaut, therapist. I mean, it was just it's very I was very encouraged, and I think that women hearing more about how they can make a difference through elective office early on will make a difference. And I talked about that in my book because boys get encouraged to run for office. It's like this, it's very simple. Men start their own businesses because they want to be their own CEO, they want to be the leader of the company. Women tend to think of starting their own business so that they can be more flexible, so they can serve their husband and their kids and be around to take care of them. Very different motivation. So what we need to do is start encouraging women to be ambitious and to seek a leadership position, just like the way we encourage boys. And I actually think that's already happening. I was really excited after talking to the teens.
Well, and this is the work, right? Like this is how you do it. This is how you get more young people, and you give them Mary's book. Veronica said that many thanks to you. She calls you Dame Hayashi, which I love, for sharing your insights and experiences. They're quite important for me since my studies focus on the Imaginarium, precisely what you're talking about, quite inspiring. So opening up that space. So not a question, but some praise for you, Dame Hayashi. I love that. Two questions have maybe similar angles here. Mary, do you have recommendations or resources for organizations available to support women pursuing political leadership? And then another attendee asks, anonymous attendee asks, I'm so inspired by your work, Mary. Thank you. How can we as citizens support women in politics so that they aren't impacted by these various barriers? And maybe if you talk about the groups that you think are doing the best work in this area, we can all support them.
Yes, and just to comment on the imagination barrier acknowledgement, thank you. One thing that I also want to highlight is that when we think about imagination barriers, like it's same for men as well. Like they need to see like Kamala Harris' husband, the second gentleman, who is actually enjoying that role. And so that seeing a female vice president and a spouse who is supporting a woman of color vice president in a leadership role, that role modeling is just as important. Because remember, when Sarah Palin was the vice presidential candidate, her husband got, they were making fun of him because he was like a stay-at-home dad and he took care of the kids, and so that is a bad example. That is not going to help with eliminating imagination barriers. So I think it's true for men as well as women that they need good role modeling as well. So thank you for the feedback. And then for resources, I always love recommending Emerge. They are organized in more than half of the country now, state by state. Like when I ran, Andrea was just starting that organization, and she said, "Oh, I want to help, train women to run for office." And so I didn't have the benefit of going through like an Emerge program, and so I made a lot of mistakes, when I was a first time candidate. But now when you apply and you get accepted, they can train you with some very basic things, how to put together a campaign and, how to, hone in your messaging. And now because of social media, you can actually develop and control your brand. When I ran, we didn't have social media. And when you're attacked, by your opponent, you have to design, print, and then take the mailer to a post office. It's like a week later. You can't even respond quickly to criticisms. And so things are very different now. And I think groups like Emerge can help, navigate some of those very basic things. Emily's List was created to, elect more women to U.S. Senate, but over the years, they really evolved because they realized that due to term limits, you got to get women in the pipeline. So you got to start from like city council, school board. That's where more women are likely to run for city council and school board, not like what I did. And so they are getting more involved at the local level as well. So Emily's List is another organization. I think annually they have an application process where you apply to be accepted to their training. And then once you're accepted, you can go through their training. So those are a couple of resources that are very important.
So, folks, support those organizations. Write a check if you can. Support them in other ways. Anonymous asks, is there anything that bothers you about how women's leadership or women politicians are portrayed on TV or in the movies?
Yes. And thank God for the Representation Project, constantly reminding the media what they shouldn't do. So, yes, because all politicians experience, the glare of media coverage and a volatile news environment. That's given, of course. But what's really unfair is that when women running for public office are often evaluated more for their appearance and their personality and their family background, like who they're married to or who their kids are, whereas men tend to get coverage around like their policy positions. Women get more, featured on their appearance, and that's a real problem because, studies have shown that when the press talks about women's candidates' looks, she becomes less likable, and it doesn't matter if the coverage is positive, negative, or neutral. The minute you talk about the fact that she's a woman, people's unconscious bias sort of kicks in and reminds them, oh, they shouldn't be there. They shouldn't be ambitious. And so women, when they announce their candidacy, they're usually like they start at a deficit. They're usually met with like suspicion, like, oh, why is she running? It's kind of like what I got. Like, well, why are you running? You should run for something small, like local things first. You don't have any experience. And so I think, that definitely is a challenge. Media is definitely a challenge for women running for office. And then social media, which I didn't experience when I was a candidate, but it's been well documented that there's an enormous amount of risk for women in politics. I think Facebook study showed that Democratic female and women of color experience, more biases based on, they're attacked more because of their physical appearance, whereas men tend to be, men get attacked based on their professional responsibilities. And so these are some of the challenges that women in politics experience with respect to media.
Mm, yes. Okay. So we live a magic wand, no sexism in media. I remember doing a study of Sarah Palin just before the emergence of social media, and it was emerging, shall we say, but it hadn't become a widespread phenomenon. And we did an experiment of legacy media and sexism she faced, and then we did a content analysis of social media, and the
Mm.
sexism was about 10 times worse because it's a public square and there aren't, it's not curated content by and large, and kind of saw what was coming next, and all of the studies since have found exactly what you're talking about. Becca has a question about data, which ties into this. She says, "I'm so inspired by the work you've done to advocate for better government data collection that includes marginalized people in dignified ways. Are there still limiting gaps when it comes to how data is collected?" And Mary, I'll just add to that: is there data you would like to see collected that we don't have?
I think over the last, President Clinton's administration really started this and jump started this. And of course, there's always room for improvement. But one of the biggest problems is sort of covering diversity, because within Asian Americans, there's like 30 different ethnicities. And so it's extremely difficult to do nationwide, scale credible study on, let's say, breast cancer incidence and preventative rates for Japanese American versus Vietnamese American. I mean, so those data actually, some of those things actually exist now because of all the work that I've done through my organization and others. But I think just breaking that down, and I think when we talk about gender now, we're not just talking about man or woman, and so just covering the diversity, that exists now and capturing that through sort of large scale studies is so important. I learned that like when I started this organization when I was 26, I figured out that the reason why there's no Asian American women's or healthcare organizations is because according to Center for Disease Control Prevention, we have no problems. We don't even exist. And then they take that data that they do and they decide how much money should go to different communities. And so I said, oh gosh, so the only way for us to show that we deserve preventative care money from federal government is to show that we have problem, but then we don't even exist. So where do you start? At least we're not at that point. So we did have tremendous progress over the last 2 decades collecting data, but there's certainly more diversity that could be included, and there's still a lot of challenges with that. And if you're not included, you're not going to get the funding.
That's right, right there.
Mhm.
You're not included, you're not going to get the funding,
Yeah.
you won't be able to identify gaps in representation. I mean, data can be so powerful in the fight for social justice. Um, Last question, and I know we're default recording, but I want to make sure that uh, we are
Recording in progress.
it's already in progress, but I want to make sure to get this last question because it really ties into everything that you said. I want to record it to the cloud. With women, particularly women of color, ascending to higher levels of leadership, like Vice President Kamala Harris and Chief, look at that slip, Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson. How do you envision the future of women in politics? Are these women inspiring to you? Is this what the future of politics looks like?
Yes. And I had an opportunity to work on Mayor Karen Bass's campaign. And I also served on her transition team. And, she raised $9 million. And I think a lot of people say, well, that's a lot of money. But her opponent wrote a check to himself from himself for $108 million. So you can see the disparity. And we won that race by 7 points. And so, and most of Karen's donations were, $100 average. And the limit is $1,500 per person. So those were small dollars. And so I always like to to point out the fact that women could do anything, and do you think Karen was intimidated by the money? I'm sure she was, but I never saw that. I never saw her ever become, insecure or threatened or I mean, she was concerned, but it just never derailed her. She was like, I'm going to stay the course. My messaging is good, and I'm just going to keep going. And a lot of these women, and she's, by the way, she's the first woman mayor and first Black woman mayor of LA, which is really exciting. And she was the first Black woman speaker of the assembly when I was in the legislature in the entire country. Um, and, it was an easy path for her. I mean, she often was, when she was the speaker, she was often questioned like, oh, is she strong enough to lead? And she got that question during her mayor race too. Like, are you strong enough to lead LA? Because we're supposed to be feminine, I guess, or they think we are, and we're not strong enough to lead, and so women of color, we experience these tests and these experiences, but look at the way everyone have moved forward, and look at the way she's conducted herself through the campaign and now as the mayor. I mean, and of course the Supreme Court justice, as well as many other women examples in my book, they have overcome incredible challenges and odds, and they move forward, and because they have a passion for social change or they want to fix a problem. I mean, that's really simple, but it's really that passion that you have to have. And so, yes, I think that representative democracy is playing out in front of us. We have long ways to go, but in California, for the first time in history, the state senate will achieve gender parity this year. We're going to have 20 women out of 40. That is the first time in our history. And in California, over 4,497 state legislators have served since 1911, and only 192 have been women. And so when we think about things in that context, yes, we're happy that these trailblazers are finally winning and we're getting the parity in the Senate, but we have generations to compensate for. So I'm excited about the future. We've already seen the change. And I think forums like this, organizations like yours, the Representation Project, have made a huge, huge dent in achieving charity. So I'm achieving parity. So I'm really grateful for all that you've done and all the questions and all the participants today.
Well, and your book advances this, right? It advances the work dramatically because, as I said, it's a page turner and it tells the story of the barriers that women face through personal stories and, of course, buttressed by rich data. So, everyone, check out Mary's new book. Even though she doesn't like to write, as all writers, it's a painful process. She has something really important to say in the world, and it's going to have an incredible impact, especially for young people. So this should be on your list for all the young women and perhaps the young men in your life, so that they can imagine a world with 50-50 representation when it comes to gender and politics. So Mary, thank you for your time. Thank you for this incredible conversation, and we will definitely see you soon as our paths cross, because you're doing this same work pushing for gender justice in politics. Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care, y'all.